first of all, can you see my screen?
Yeah, it looks good, Hector.
Okay, so hello everybody. Today I'm Hector Santiago, Regional Rivers Coordinator at the National Park Service out of the region formerly known as the Midwest out of Omaha. And today I'm going to be giving a presentation, kind of an NPS perspective on VR and river management, in particular, linked to the things that I do, which is heavily on Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, compliance and dealing with the scenic ORV. So if you have any questions, we'll have questions after our two presentations. Although if anyone needs to interrupt me for any reason, I'm a pretty nice guy, so it's not a big deal. All right, so this is a visual resources and river management. Let's see if this will move now. Okay, when thinking about visual resources and river management, I'm trying to read here and gets, okay. At the National Park Service, it is rare the time that we are not also thinking about our responsibilities under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was enacted in 1968 to complement a national policy of dam and construction. It was to protect and enhance free-flowing conditions, water quality, and the outstanding remarkable values, or ORVs, for which these rivers were designated. It also established a process by which rivers may be added to the National Wild and Scenic River System beyond the original 8. A wild and scenic river cannot be designated without the existence of at least one outstanding remarkable value, or ORV, and scenic is typically one of them. And each WSR park must have its river value sufficiently described and located on a map within a river segment, enough to evaluate the potential effects of projects on these values. And for parks with NRIs, or Nationwide Rivers Inventory rivers, or eligible and suitable rivers present within their boundaries, it is also necessary to avoid impacts to these listed values as they exist in your park, so as not to preclude the river from its potential for designation in the future. Of these ORVs, the scenic ORV is often one of the, if not the most challenging to protect, especially when important viewsheds are more often than not outside of our jurisdiction, and those resources are relatively narrow, as in a river corridor. We also manage Nationwide Rivers Inventories, and Nationwide Rivers Inventory is a listing of more than 3,200 free-flowing rivers segments in the United States that are believed to possess one or more outstanding remarkable values. NRI segments are potential candidates for inclusion into the National Park System. In our region, 16 parks have NRI segments within them. What this means is we have to consider the impacts of what we do on the scenic quality and scenic character of those rivers within the river corridor. Oftentimes that's within 1/4 of a mile. Of course, it's much more expansive sometimes in the context of a park. The NPS and our other river administering agencies, the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, we all have regulatory responsibilities also under Section 7A of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. This can be an effective regulatory tool to compel a project proponent to be sensitive to individual resources. The most common projects that trigger 7A are bridges, bank stabilizations, river access, and other similar activities that require 404 permits from the Army Corps of Engineers. And they almost always involve an assessment of impacts to the scenic character of an area. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act provides its management direction to the NPS under Section 10A of the Act. Section 10A is considered the anti-degradation and enhancement policy of the Act. Primary emphasis is given to protecting aesthetic and scenic resources, among other features. The challenge is often to provide for public recreation or recreational use without degrading values. And that infrastructure sometimes can provide some visual intrusions that are hard to deal with. So in order to meet this challenge, we need to have a plan. In fact, congressionally designated components of the Wild Scenic River System are required to have a comprehensive management plan, or CRMP. A CRMP is a more detailed plan to address ORVs, management goals, desired conditions, land facility development, user capacities, water quality, all of those things. Keeping these documents relevant to meet the current management needs of rivers over time requires rethinking strategies to address evolving threats and opportunities. A visual resource inventory is particularly important to describe critical baseline and conditions and inform the CRMP as it prescribes management strategies based on the special attributes of an area. Many of the same tools we use to protect watersheds and drainage networks from development apply with an emphasis on strategies that maintain or improve scenery. Protecting watersheds and viewsheds can be one and the same. A diversity of management tools are necessary in support of scenic ORV, especially when river parks don't own land, or in the case of state managed rivers, where planning and management relies more heavily on state resources, agencies, and partnerships. Visual resource inventories and scenic easements are just two tools in the toolbox, but they can be pretty effective. As the National Park Service has been developing its own protocols for visual resource management through Enjoy the View, my experience has been with the Missouri National Recreational River and with the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And the Cuyahoga Valley River National Park conducted a visual resource inventory as part of a pre-eligibility study for a potential designation into the national system. And they adapted the VRM tools, for riverine applications. This NPS visual resource inventory, river-specific view description and scenic quality data sheet includes ice and flood events as seasonal or ephemeral events that may affect the scenic quality of a view, and added river-related landscape elements to the form, including channel form and channel features like bars, banks, and terraces, rivers, pools, and runs. This slide here is just to underscore how important it is, especially with wild and scenic rivers, to work together in multi-jurisdictional partnerships. One of the linking themes through the presentation you'll probably see is that there's only so much we can do within a narrow corridor that is a wild and scenic river. On average, let's just say 1/4 of a mile on either side of a river. So it's very important to have friends outside our boundaries in order to be able to assess and protect those view sheds that don't just stop, at the park boundary. In our region, of the 60 parks in the region, formerly known as the Midwest, over 25% had responsibilities related to the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and VR management. In our region, we manage 3 congressionally designated components of the system, 4 national rivers, and several recreational areas. We also have administrative regulatory responsibilities as I've discussed previously. You may recognize a few of these rivers. They all rely on visual resources. The St. Croix National Scenic River, pictured here, one of the original 8 wild and scenic rivers, is a beautiful place, but within an hour of Minneapolis and encompassing 255 miles in 2 states, it has its challenges managing transportation projects and urban pressures, as well as recreational use. It so happens to have the most or second most amount of scenic easements in the National Park Service. The Wolf is another of the original 8. It is amazing. It's managed by the Menominee Tribe of Wisconsin, and they do a pretty good job. The Missouri National Recreational River is challenged with bank armoring, as it's managed for navigation, among other authorized purposes, and the occasional communication tower. In order to better administer the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, this is one of the parks that has actually done a visual resource inventory and did a Enjoy the View workshop with Mark. Would have been probably what, maybe 4 years ago. Forget the date.
Yeah, think about that. Yep.
Yeah. And then of course the Niobrara, the Niobrara Scenic River, it's kind of a de facto partnership river. It has a lot of issues, relies a lot on, we don't own any land there, so relies a lot on zoning and local partnerships and outfitter cooperation to protect views. Won't say much about Big Darby Creek. This is my home watershed, except to say this is a river actually is classified as scenic, doesn't technically have a scenic ORV, but needless to say, it's in the name and we manage for it. Okay, and then this is just to say that we have many NRI rivers in our parks in the Midwest. Okay, when it comes to the scenic ORV, there are many threats. Bridges, recreational infrastructure like docks and landings, and bank stabilization projects tend to be the easiest to manage on account. And what else here? Comm towers, power lines, wind turbines, all those things tend to be somewhat problematic. The things that happen across the river are much more, or within the bend banks of the river, are sometimes easier for us to deal with because we have a regulatory hook. Again, those challenges outside, like the cell towers and the wind turbines themselves, can be quite challenging. Let's see. So I had a couple of examples of some of the projects that maybe have helped kind of push me and the National Park Service towards incorporating VRM protocols and doing visual resource inventories. And more often, in particular with wild and scenic rivers. And it all started with a bridge, the Stillwater Bridge Crossing Project of the Lower St. Croix National Scenic Riverway. It's a classic example of the inseparable relationship between visual resources and wild and scenic rivers. And especially in a regulatory context, it was also a crash course in the value and importance of visual resource inventories in river management for legal defense even. As is often the case with transportation projects, in this case, a bridge, a purpose and need was established, something to do with traffic and the quality of life. Traffic's backing up every time the bridge would go up, increase in tourism, lots of congestion, the bridge was structurally deficient. All of those things are rationales, and they're all real concerns and that needed to be addressed. Okay, that being said, there was, from a scenic rivers perspective, there was a problem. A highway bridge would have to be constructed at a location where none existed before, and it would be difficult for the National Park Service to render an affirmative Section 7A determination because the scenic character of the area would be substantially changed. Over many years of deliberation and stakeholder processes, there are 3 different alternatives were proposed. The NPS did 4 different 7A evaluations. Each bridge differed in regard to location and bridge type. So in 96, it was a highway bridge with 8 piers. In 2000, it was 5 to 7 piers with a deck tight arch bridge. And in 2005, it was an extra dose bridge, 6 piers in the river. The extra dose, I think ultimately the bottom one there in 2000 is essentially the design that was eventually constructed. In the last 2 7A processes, visual intrusions were proposed to be removed as mitigation and for impacts to visual resources. And the question of whether the lift bridge would stay or go was also answered as the bridge remained to become part of a multi-use trail. So that's the picture on the bottom right there. Okay, in 1996, then the project would have a direct and adverse effect. We determined the project would have a direct reverse effect on the massive impacts to scenery In 2005, we reversed ourselves on account that there was a mitigation package that was established. In the end, the issue was litigated and the court decided that our rationale was arbitrary and capricious. We had to better describe the scenic ORV and more rigorously account for the expected impacts to the scenic ORV in another 7A rendered in 2010. Okay, and this is where I think we then really began to think hard about how better to articulate, to both describe visual resources, scenic character of an area. And the way we did that was by adapting the BLM visual resource management system. Okay, that brought us a more interdisciplinary approach to evaluating the impacts of introducing a new structure into an environment. It took into account existing landscape character, visual contrast ratings, and the visual resources classes and the setting into account. We didn't evaluate the aesthetics qualities of the structure directly, but we did find a way to better describe and essentially quantify the impacts because the judge wanted us to describe what was going on. So anyways, after this whole mess, in a sense, back in 2010, there were some management implications. Number one is, elevating the emphasis on well-reasoned decision-making and regulatory determinations, avoiding arbitrary and capricious findings. And in visual resources, that is finding the right way to describe and to quantify, use a repeatable process. And that's what the BLM VRM protocol was for us. We also began to manage more directly to protect and enhance all ORVs collectively, but we also had to kind of elevate, we had to protect our values. We had to protect values, like say the scenic ORV, by enhancing the scenic ORV. There was no trading of mitigation. So for example, there's no impacting scenery and then enhancing or doing some mitigation for fish wildlife or something. And that was something that we learned. And last but not least, defining scenic resources more clearly was something which we're still in the process of learning to do. Other examples I've dealt with, wind turbines. I've dealt with a couple of the wind turbine projects, often most concerned about the sound and the visual intrusions, including the effects of red lights in the sky. So this is the California Ridge Turbines project. Again, some of the challenges was proximity to the river. You might hear it, you might see it, night sky. But it's also an example of a project that's outside of the boundaries of the river, outside of my regulatory jurisdiction. So having to work with the power company and, for lack of a better term, bluffing your way through getting a visibility analysis and an auditory analysis and the eventual removal of one turbine was a successful implementation of the anti-degradation policy of the act, but again, outside of the river corridor. So that was kind of a win. Another example of this is happens to be a cell phone tower on the St. Croix. It's approximately 1/4 to 1.5 miles east of the federally protected lower St. Croix Scenic Riverway. And one town approved to a special exemption in the protective zoning out there to build, but the county did not approve the construction of the cell tower because scenic river values were going to be affected. Litigation between the company and the county ensued, and a judge then decided in favor of the county for lack of alternatives. I think ultimately the most important thing for us as scenic river managers, though, was that the judge in his language used anti-degradation language and upheld the policy that whoa, we might be able to expand a little bit in our interpretation as to what view sheds we may be able to protect through the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. In this case, of course, it's beyond the boundaries, but if you can see it, there might be some legal or concern. So we got help from a judge outside our boundaries. It was nice to see. A couple more examples here, just very quickly. This is actually a current project I'm working on right now. The bottom line is this was an illicit channel modification, and it was discovered by some river advocacy group, and we've had to kind of reverse engineer a solution here. And ultimately, the picture on the top is what this particular bank used to look like. And so the challenge we have now is working with the EPA and the Department of Natural Resources and myself and the Army Corps of Engineers. We're basically having this area be restored back to some stable bank as it was before. Hopefully it'll look better than it does now. But the challenge here is, of course, that we didn't have a lot of our enforcement was based, or dependent on those other agencies. And so, we got some success in getting help again. Very little of what we do in visual resource management with wild and scenic rivers is done independently. Those partnerships and those collaborations really matter. Okay, this one very quickly is another current project going on in St. Croix. It's a recreational infrastructure, landings, docks, and comfort structures in the lower St. Croix also. Some of the challenges was and in general challenges is meeting recreational needs while also satisfying the requirement to protect and enhance, not degrade the scenic character of an area. In the end, in this situation here, one of the solutions that we found is throughout the 255 miles of the river, identifying where it's appropriate to develop more, consistent with, say, the recreational ORV, and and try to also then in that respect then avoid what I call sprawl, right? Avoidance of recreational, river access sprawl. So very quickly, VR goals that I have for myself, to continue to encourage river parks to conduct visual resource inventories. I know that the St. Croix is one that is very challenging because it's so long, 255 miles. And in being so, you can imagine the time and effort it might take to do that, but it's still on my list. Integrating VRM principles into regulatory decisions, and also ensuring upcoming CRMPs include VRI-based strategies for viewshed management and scenic river or scenic ORV protection. So key takeaways are scenic resources are an integral part of wild and scenic rivers management, regardless of classification, and must be actively managed in accordance with the WSRA, Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. VR management in rivers is challenging, and it's nearly impossible to succeed without multi-jurisdictional cooperation. Visual resource management tools like Enjoy the View are critical to developing legal, defensive, and anti-degradation strategies to protect and enhance scenic ORV. And yes, it is easy to ruin a view, not easy to restore one. So thank you. Sorry, I went a little over there, Monica.
Oh, that's okay. I'm going to get my presentation loaded. And Hector and I saved some room at the end to take any questions. But while I'm loading my PowerPoint, if anyone had any questions for Hector. All right, can you see that okay, Hector?
I do.
Great, get my. All right, so I'm Monica Zimmerman and I work with the Bureau of Land Management and I'm an outdoor recreation planner there. And I'm just gonna go ahead and jump in. Thanks to Hector, he provided a great example of how the National Park Service manages visual resources and on a wild and scenic river. I am going to present an example of managing visual resources and providing river management along a river corridor that is not a wild and scenic river. So just to give you a little bit of a different take on managing visual resources. Just to orient you a little bit of the area where I work in the Upper Snake Field Office for the BLM, and I am out of the Idaho Falls office, and we're located in Southeast Idaho. So you can see in this little red square where we are located in Southeast Idaho. And for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the Snake River area of critical environmental concern, kind of as our case study. And the specific area we're going to look at, it's the Snake River area of critical environmental concern. It's also designated as a special recreation management area for the significant recreational resources found along the river corridors. And so this area, it's actually, when I say river corridor, it's actually 3 different segments. They make up the Snake River ACEC. So to orient you, you can see off to the east is Jackson, Wyoming. So Grand Teton National Park is just to the east of us over the border, and Yellowstone is to the northeast of us. And so the 3 river corridors that are included in the Snake River ACEC are the South Fork, which begins here at Palisades Dam and flows to the northwest, to the confluence with the Henry's Fork, which comes in from the north. And then at the confluence, it becomes the main Snake River. And so that's the specific area I am talking about in this presentation. So the ACEC, through a report that was done by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1980, the river corridor was identified as the most valuable, biodiverse, and unique ecosystem in Idaho. And because of that significance, BLM determined to designate this river system as an ACEC, as well as a special recreation management area in 1985. This river corridor has one of the largest remaining cottonwood gallery forests remaining in the Western United States. And there are numerous different species that depend on this unique habitat. Numerous T&E species. There's yellow-billed cuckoo, which is a bird species that depends on the cottonwood forest, as well as a threatened plant species called the Lady Tress's orchid. There's also a half of bald eagle population in Idaho is located on this river system. Over 120 bird species, which many are neotropical migrants. And then along with all of those bird species is the diverse wildlife that depend on this river system, everything from mountain lions to big game such as moose, elk, and deer. And just to tie a little bit to Hector's presentation, the South Fork, so essentially the South Fork is from Palisades Dam to the confluence. That reach of the river is eligible for inclusion in the Wild and Scenic River system. Okay, so getting to visual resources and river management. So the river corridor, along with those amazing resources that I just highlighted, which is the purpose for the ACEC, are the significant visual resources that exist on this landscape. And in this presentation, I'm going to cover 2 tools that our field office utilizes to manage the river corridor. One is, one of our tools is our river management plan, and the second tool is our Land and Water Conservation Fund partnership. These are the tools we use. And so the first tool that I want to cover is our river management plan, which is called the Snake River Activity Operations plan. And within this planning document, it specifically provides management guidance for visual resources because of the high scenic values found within these river corridors. There is guidance for visual resources, guidance for recreation. We receive over 200,000 visitors a year, and primarily individuals that are coming to fish the native Yellowstone cutthroat trout fishery that exists on this river corridor. The plan provides direction for resource management, such as the riparian resources and cultural resources, and then also specific management related to the wildlife resources within these river corridors. And so along with the different resources exist, the uses, management problems, they differ along the different reaches of the river. And so this is what we call the upper reach of the South Fork, and it's in a high mountain valley, and you can see the amazing scenic resources that exists in this landscape. But in this reach, in the foreground, in the cottonwood trees in the foreground, those are BLM managed lands, and in the background, it's hard to tell, but those are private lands that butt up next to the river corridor, where we have a lot of second home cabin type development right up against the river corridor. So you can see how the uses kind of change and our management changes with the different reaches. This is also a very popular reach of the river where we get a lot of use. As the river flows downriver, it flows into a scenic rugged canyon. It's about half of the canyon is roadless, and it's bound to the north by Forest Service, and then to the south in the islands, BLM managed land, and up on the upper benches up here, those are actually private lands. As the river corridor goes out of the canyon, the lower end of the canyon changes visually, and so of course our use changes, management changes, but we do have now a road corridor that's along it, and so because use changes, our management changes. So in the canyon, we do have specific management. For example, we do require the public to stay in designated camping sites due to the amazing resources such as the bald eagle nesting areas within the canyon. But as the river moves downstream, it leaves the canyon and it starts to flow out to the west onto a broad open floodplain. And you can see here how those resources change as long as our the development against the river changes. And then this is the lower portion of the South Fork, and the main snake and Henry's Fork are similar to this, where the river corridor is bound by private lands. It does braid a lot more, and so you can see how management could differ along this different reach of the river. So because we have, we recognize that the resources, the uses and the management problems differ within the different reaches of the river. Within our management plan, we determined to develop what we call site-specific management classes. And so we've divided up our river to help us manage. And these classes, the definition of these classes are based on visual resource management classes, recreation setting characteristics, and tentative wild and scenic river classifications. And this map is kind of confusing right now, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into and help describe those three different factors that our site-specific management class definitions are based off of, and that's how we came up with our management classes. So the first one is our visual resource management classes that are identified for the river corridor. So you can see with this map, the majority of the river is classified as a VRM, Visual Resource Management Class 2, which the objective of this class is to retain the existing character of the landscape, and the level of change to the landscape should be low, and management actions can be seen, management activities can be seen, but they should not attract the attention of a casual viewer. So the majority is a VRM2. We do have within the canyon reach where we have wilderness study area islands that are a visual resource management class 1. And the objective of this class is to preserve the existing character of the landscape and try to maintain those natural ecological systems. And so that's one of the factors of the definition of our site-specific management class is the established visual resource management classes for the river corridor. The second factor that we considered is to roll into our definition is the recreation setting characteristics for the river corridor. And so this is the recreation setting characteristics matrix. And the first row here specifically looks at the physical setting. So this is the character of the natural landscape. And so this is really one of the factors that ties into visual resources, looking at what is the physical character of that landscape. So we look at the river corridor and we can determine from the remoteness character, do we want to, is an area, does it fit more into a backcountry where there's not many roads nearby, or does the remoteness fit into more rural or urban where there's highways or paved roads adjacent? The naturalness character is, you know, if it's more primitive, we're managing for more of a natural landscape, whereas if you go across to the right to rural and urban, we're managing for more of a landscape that may have modifications with agricultural or industrial development. And so just to give you an idea, the canyon reach pictures, those are more in this backcountry setting for the physical character. And then some of the reaches, for example, the upper reach of the river may be more in this rural front country. So there's also the facilities, what type of facilities are associated on the physical landscape. And we're talking about trails, facilities such as campgrounds or boat launches. The next two items within the recreation setting characteristics are the social character, which is, this is the character of the recreation tourism use. And so this really gets to, you know, how do we handle our river management on the river corridor? What are the contacts like? Is there limited contacts with backcountry, or is it more we see people generally everywhere? We look at the group size, which primitive backcountry is not seeing many people, whereas front country, you do have larger size groups. And then the third item in here is the social, which these are no alterations to the environment, whereas over here, there's some alteration. And the third item within here is administratively. So what is the mechanized motorized use? And it goes along the matrix for less or non-motorized use to motorized use to your right. What are the visitor services that are provided? So what type of maps, or is information generally everywhere? And then the third one is the management controls, as far as is there limited presence by BLM staff, or are regulations prominent? Do we have law enforcement? So this is one of the second factors that we use to develop our site-specific management classes. And the third factor that we used to develop the definitions is the tentative wild and scenic river classification. So the tentative classification of a river found to be eligible is based on the condition of the river and the adjacent lands as they exist at the time of study. And so really determining that tentative classification helps establish guidelines for management until either a suitability determination is made or a designation decision is made. And so it helps you give an understanding of what are the existing developments that are on a river corridor. And so there are 4 key attributes that are looked at: water resource development, shoreline development, accessibility, and water quality. And so to help visualize what that looks like, this is just an excerpt from the BLM manual for wild and scenic rivers. And this is also consistent with the interagency guidance for wild and scenic rivers. So here's the attribute right here: water resource development. And then here are the classifications. Free wild classification would be free of impoundments. whereas a recreational classification would have some existing impoundments. Hector mentioned outstanding remarkable values in his presentation. Just because there might be a scenic outstanding remarkable value doesn't necessarily mean that a river would be classified as scenic. Remember, classification is specific to the development that is on the river corridor. So river classification is based on the condition at the time of the study process and gives a baseline for which to manage and monitor the river in the future. So now so basically what we did is in our management plan, we took those three factors. We took the visual resource management classes, and we took the recreation setting characteristics, and we took the tentative wild and scenic river classifications identified for the river corridors, and we brought those together and developed the site-specific management class definitions for our river corridors. So how, what are those sideboards for how we're going to manage our river? And so the first three categories, the physical setting, water resources, and then on the next page is shoreline development. Those really are tied closely to visual resources. But the definition for our class 1 areas, those are our unmodified natural environment. And then it goes along a spectrum to a class 3, where this is where we could have some modifications. There could be some structures. Water resources, a class 1 are areas where there's free of impoundments, whereas a class 3, there's some existing impoundments or diversions. And then here's the rest of our definitions. So shoreline development, once again, this really ties to help give us guidance for how to manage visual resources. Class 1 are those primitive areas and little evidence of human, whereas a class 3, those are evidence of human activity, some development. Accessibility, this is basically tied to how the public accesses the river corridor. So this gets into the next 3 get into river management, whereas accessibility is class 1, there's really not. It's really accessible mostly by trails or roads. And you move across to class 3, these are areas that are readily accessible by the road, from the road or by boats. Social setting, so class 1, low contact, moving over to class 3, a lot of more frequent contact, and then managerial, this is on site, not a lot of controls, and then moving over where we do have a lot of control in class 3. So going back to my map, so hopefully this map makes a little bit more sense now, and why, after reviewing how we came up with our definitions. And so you can see we can have a number of class 3 sections. And so the A, B, C, that just coincides with there's 4 different class 3 sections. These skinny sections of class 3, that's essentially where there's bridges across the river. So if you can imagine visually, that does have a different aspect. Here's our class 2 reaches. So here's the first one, second, and on down to down here. And then we do have 2 class 1 sections. So essentially, this helps guide our management and helps us to determine what activities are acceptable in each class. So dividing our river corridor in these different classes provides helps us provide management for recreation. It helps us provide sideboards for what type of facility development we would do within the different classes. It also helps us determine how we're going to manage the resource uses as well as the visual resources within these areas. Okay, the second factor or second tool that I wanted to cover in this presentation that helps us manage visual resources as well as provide river management on the river corridor is our Land and Water Conservation Fund partnership. And essentially the BLM receives LWCF funds to help us to acquire lands and areas to help maintain open spaces. The LWCF Act also provides funding to the states to assist with development of lands and waters for recreation and open space. So the LWCF Act was specifically established for two purposes: to provide open spaces and recreation opportunities. There are other resources that benefit from the LWCF program, and you can see some of the examples here. And then, really tied to visual resource, scenic is a huge benefactor here if we can acquire lands for open spaces. So like many rivers, because they are so beautiful, it does draw, there is potential for development pressure on river corridors. And so this is what's happening on our river system in the Swan Valley Reach, where we have home development pressure. And along with that home development pressure, we get riprapping to armor the bank to protect their home. And we also get some commercial development that occurs on the river system. And so to help us protect those visual resources in our river management, we have what's called our LWCF Land Conservation Partnership. And we have partners with the Conservation Fund, a local land trust, and the Nature Conservancy to help us work with landowners to acquire lands in fee title, or to acquire an interest with a private landowner through a conservation easement or a scenic easement to help preserve those open space and limit development, like we saw in the previous slide with the homes being developed. And so this partnership, since the early 90s, we've been able to protect over 24,000 acres. And this partnership, we have been funded over $60 million to work toward fee title acquisitions and conservation easements. And the BLM alone, we have brought in over $40 million in LWCF funds to go toward this effort of acquiring lands or obtaining conservation easements. I have just some examples, and I'm actually going to go through them pretty quickly so that I can leave, so that Hector and I can leave time for questions. But this is one of our conservation easement. And so if you look at this lower picture, this bench right up here, the Aspen bench, this was actually slated for a subdivision. And down here on the bottoms, you can't see it very well, was slated for a marina and a golf course. And so that was proposed in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And that's really what kicked off the partnership on the river corridor to help protect these lands. And that's when we, in 1991, is when we started to receive funding to protect the viewshed. And so this is a conservation easement that we obtained with this landowner. We basically got rid of that subdivision and that development. And this was right in the heart of the canyon. It was also would have had development up here on this bench. I'm going to just flip through these other examples real quick so I can get to questions, but these are just other examples of where there was potential subdivision development where we've now protected these lands through easements. So this is the canyon reach, and it was for the site-specific management class. It was a class 1 and a class 2. And so very significant visual resources exist in the canyon, along with, we have a lot of river management guidance that we have for this section. And so the purple, those are the land acquisitions, either purchasing land in fee title or conservation easement to help protect the visual quality of that canyon reach. And then here, this is the confluence of the Henry's Fork and South Fork. And the purple, these are same thing, easements or acquisitions that we've entered into with private landowners to protect the visual quality and help us with river management. And so just to help wrap up the presentation, visual resources are protected through our planning. So through our management plan for the river corridor, protected through the partnership that we have utilizing land and water conservation funds, the strong support from the community as well as our partners, and then the funding that we receive to do many of these acquisitions and easements, and then the passion of staff as well as our partners to succeed on managing this river system. Right, and that's all I had, and Hector and I can take questions on our presentation.
Great. Thanks, Monica. Hector, that was great. And please, if anybody does have questions, feel free to put them into the chat box and we can go from there. I did see one come up earlier where James Fanesh had identified where Terrain 360 data may be available. And I don't know the complete availability of that, but I have, as far as all the rivers, but I have seen that product demonstrated, and it could be a valuable tool for the areas that it does exist. Have either of you used that particular set of data for any kind of management or inventory type of activities?
I have not.
I have not, but I wrote it down. I'm going to try
Yep, so did I.
look into it. So.
Okay, good. All right. Well, I'm not necessarily seeing a lot of questions. Oh, there we go. Is there a web link to the Enjoy the View tools? Actually, I can probably answer that one. Yeah, those, all the forms and things that we have to date are on the BLM, the Visual Resources Clearinghouse website that was up earlier that John had identified. John McCarty. So they are all there. The new version of our training manual is probably due out in now a month or month and a half. So we'll have an updated version of the training manual, and we'll be sure and get that, on that clearinghouse as well. And then as we're developing those tools, they'll all be available then on an NPS website as well. Anything else? I'm not seeing a lot of other questions come up. So I think anybody feel free to jump in anytime, but if there are no other questions at the moment, just kind of start to wrap up a little bit. Over the last couple of days, we've seen a lot of training. There's been a lot of material to absorb. If you've been through kind of all the sessions, certainly a lot to try to take in. Certainly, I think I speak for a number of the speakers is, feel free to reach out, with questions or additional thoughts or ideas that, that you want to explore related to visual resources. It's just an awful lot. And I think some of the exciting part now coming up is just what we've seen here with Hector and Monica is how this stuff really starts to, where the rubber hits the road, where it matters, and how you start to use some of the information that you might inventory and things like that. So we've got some sessions coming up on section 106. And so I think, integrating the cultural resource aspect, and then, applications to specific projects, with transmission lines and things like that. So I think there's a lot of good, exciting kind of applications of all of this stuff that we've learned over the last couple of days, coming up in the next couple of days. So I hope that folks can stick around and continue through the visual track. And again, I think any of the speakers, feel free to reach out with any, thoughts or questions.
Hey, Mark, this is Becca.
Oh.
We had one more question from Corita for Hector asking, have other
Oh.
rivers been using the revised VRI worksheet you shared from the, I'm going to pronounce that wrong, but do you see it in the chat box?
Yep, Cuyahoga, right.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks for the question. Right now, and one thing I hope you've seen in our presentations is it's kind of a work in progress. So my job right now is promoting these resources and trying to integrate them into park processes and some of the regulatory functions that I was mentioning before. So the short answer is I've shared it. We're not using it as systematically, for example, as you and Monica had described. And I think in a sense that shows us a goal as to where we want to get to, is to have that kind of proficiency and use these resources consistently at our river parks. So, so wait and see, I guess. I am, Mark sends me the stuff and I share them, and we use them, for example, for hydro assessments and things like that, hydro licensing comments and assessments and things we might ask for. For example, on the St. Croix, docks are becoming an issue. So we've asked as part of a hydro licensing project for them to assess, visual impacts of docks and things like that, so it's in the works.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things, with our program is that it's relatively new. And there is not, unlike BLM, there's not an official policy yet. There's not an official, say, you shall do this kind of thing. Now, certainly the BLM, having worked with John over the years, it depends a lot on the people on the ground and in the field offices. You've got you got to have people like Monica is like implementing this stuff, on the ground. There is a mandate for them to have visual resource management classes and inventories on lands. And our program right now, it's all voluntary and stuff. So when issues come up, that's when parks reach out. And what we want to get is in that mindset of getting that inventory out there in advance so that it's in place and you can be thinking about some of these things before they happen. And then you can express your concerns based on this existing information that you'd already collected rather than in a reactionary mode.
Exactly.